This quiet holds a different kind of weight, a heavy silence in the Irish Midlands. The peat moss breathes 1,000 years of rain, feeling the pulse of the deep wet ground again. It's not an empty space but full of soul, this ancient pressure making my heart whole. Halloween night and a Friday the 13th, another rare secret the calendar keeps. You didn't believe in the old fairy mounds, just glacial retreat on the waterlogged grounds. But you let me have my thrill, quiet and strange, a reminder the world still knows how to change. Oh Liam, that night under the Leagol's face, we were still solid in time and in place.
They called it the Whisper.
A circle, 2 meters across. The heather, not dead, but bleached, bone white, life leached out. The mist lay heavy, a shroud on the ground, as sirens wailed, a piercing sound. Blue strobes fractured the grey morning light, chasing shadows through the endless night. Inspector Miller, in his tired refrain, spoke of cold logic, of weather, of rain. No struggle here, he muttered low and deep, no boot prints leading where the secrets sleep. I knelt beside the perfect circle, green was gone. My fingers brushed the heather, bleached and bone white. The air itself was buzzing with a brittle humming sound. Then a deep, slow thrumming rose from miles beneath the ground. There's a silence in the Irish Midlands bog, like the weight of 10,000 years of fog. The Moina Luin, they call it by name, where secrets sleep inside a watery frame. I found a circle in the heather bone white, where Liam vanished in the fading light. A humming from the earth, a whispered sound. His watch and phone were warped upon the ground. He wasn't taken, he was translated through to where the veil of the world wears thin and new. They know my name is Source, now it's my turn, the lesson of the shadow folk to learn. A gaunt hair on the blackthorn root, one luminous eye, a silent truth. You watch me with that ancient gaze, lost within the bog's own maze, deciding if I'm meant to stay or if I'm meant to fade away. Before you vanish from the hollow, a path my own shadow has to follow. The fog came in from the Shannon, a high silver vibration in my skull. Vegend fuiga, the double take, a reflection made of light that has no sun, stepping into me. A long shuddering sigh of relief, the hive of ice, the hive of ice. I am translated. The road's a ribbon of resentful stone, headlights cutting frantic through the black, every instinct screaming, don't look back! Felt the ancient oil seep in my skin, 1,000 silver eyes were looking in. Had to get to Combs before the dawn, before the very road I'm on is gone. He hadn't been taken, he was translated, and I'm the only one left to read the grammar of the dead.
Lay it out, Sarah, let the ink breathe. A story held in the dark becomes a venom. It's not magic, it's a thinness in the skin, where the wrong things press their way in. The paper's wet, the pages are pressed flat. Liam stepped on a thin spot, just like that. Your shadow's pointing toward the bog, the leash is long. You've already stepped out where the rules go wrong.
Combs Cottage smelled of turf fire and old paper, a heavy warmth after the bog's vapor. He said, let the ink breathe, it's been stifled for years, and the manuscript rustled, confirming my fears. The vellum was oily, the handwriting frantic, a bridge of words across the cold Atlantic. This is the bridge of words, Liam. Your boots on the dirty ground, the salt in your skin, a scar on your thumb from a fair in Athlone. I hear you, I see you, na fag shin. You are the heavy, the messy, the loud, not the pure silent math of that shimmering crowd. The story is finished, the page is now closed, because you are a creature of salt and of soil, and you are mine. 3 months since the stone, my Liam has come home, but the moonlight on the floor shows a shadow not mine anymore. It's pointing toward the bog, a leash made of the mist and fog. They're watching now through me, a story waiting to be.
Sorry about that. Strangers were wandering in. Yeah, it was not only unlocked, it was open. So, there we go. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the Irish Midlands. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, nor is it the empty silence of a desert. It is a heavy, pressurized thing. It feels like the weight of 10,000 years of wet earth pressing against your eardrums. They call it the Moynaloon, the Bog of Allen. And I'm going to pause one more moment. Will you ever get started with a story? I am. I'm going to throw a big gabagoo in the Seanchaí library group chat that has our pronunciations for weird words tonight. So if you're interested, you can pop over there and look at those. Let's just start all over. There's a particular kind of silence that exists only in the Irish Midlands. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, nor is it the empty silence of the desert. It's a heavy, pressurized thing. It feels like the weight of 10,000 years of wet earth pressing against your eardrums. They call it the Moynaloon, the Bog of Allen. To the casual observer passing through on the motorway, it looks like a wasteland, miles of flat, brownish-purple heather and dark, stagnant pools that reflect nothing but the gray Atlantic clouds. But to a folklorist, it's a vast anaerobic archive. In the bog, peat decays and preserves in equal measure. Leather turns tough as iron, ancient wood blackens to obsidian, and secrets lie tangled beneath the surface, jealously gripped by the suffocating earth. My name is Sarah. Well, Searcher, really. But I was a product of the diaspora, born in America, and my parents dreaded a lifetime of teachers calling me Seyo Ursay, so they always called me Sarah instead. Besides, it was my grandmother's favorite name from the Bible, and she always called me her little princess. I am a doctoral student of folklore at Trinity, which is really just a polite academic way of saying I spend my life cataloging the things people are too terrified to say aloud. My heritage and blood, though, are Irish. My ancestors were fierce resistance fighters in Carlow and Wexford, and now I'm a student of storytelling, not exactly a warrior. I've spent 4 years mapping the souterrains, those ancient underground stone passages that honeycombed this land long before the first cathedral stone was laid. For 4 years, the bog was my office. 3 days ago, it became my nightmare. Liam was my research partner. He was a creature of pure, cold logic. He didn't believe in the good people, the puka or the fetch. To Liam, a fairy mound was a geological anomaly caused by a glacial retreat. A cursed well was simply a spring with a high mineral content. He believed in carbon dating, GPS coordinates, and the absolute unshakable reality of the physical world. Yet for all his clinical detachment, Liam was wonderfully, frustratingly human. This was a man who meticulously plotted those GPS coordinates and could read any map in the dark and the rain and never get lost, yet routinely lost his keys. He could debate geological anomalies for hours, but he still burned his toast every single morning. His field notes were rigidly categorized. He always left his boots just inside the door where someone else would trip over them. He was anchored to the solid, messy world, even if he refused to see it. We had a wonderful Valentine's Day together, a Halloween, as the knowing ones call it, since it followed Friday the 13th this year. Liam finally said he loved me. And now, the pattern, 4 days before St. Patrick's Day, another Friday the 13th. 3 in 1 year. An anomaly even by calendar standards. For most, a warning. For me, another quiet thrill. A reminder that the world still keeps secrets, stitched into time and place. I was never one for bad luck superstitions. If anything, 13 always felt lucky to me, a number out of step with the ordinary. Folklore is full of such odd numbers, markers of those rare years when the veil grows thin and the world feels slightly off-kilter. We had come here to document the souterrain near Liagal, the stone that weeps. Liam, ever the pragmatist, insisted these tunnels were nothing more than larders, cold storage dug by Iron Age farmers to hide butter and grain from raiders. But the legends cling to the black peat say otherwise. They speak of the Liafal, the stone of destiny at Tara, which would roar, its cry echoing across the hills to proclaim the rightful rule of the High Kings. Yet for every roar of power on the hill, there's a tear of memory in the marsh. Here in the heart of the bog, the Liagal stands as the failed silent shadow. The stone that didn't shout for a king, but wept for the fallen. The legends whisper that these passages were never meant as mere vaults for grain. They say the imul, the thresholds, like the weeping face of the Liagal, were built not to keep things in, but to let things through. The earth here remembers the thunder of prophecy and the drowning salt of the silence that follows. I looked around our tent where we had spent the last 5 days. It was pitched on a rare patch of solid ground near a cutaway, a place where the peat had been harvested in deep rectangular trenches that looked like open graves. The scene inside the tent was hauntingly domestic. Our tangled sleeping bag, his heavy wool jacket draped over the back of a folding chair. But then I saw the anomaly, what I've started calling the whisper in my field notes. Near the center of the camp, a perfect circle sprawled, exactly 2 meters across, where the heather had suffered a strange and chilling fate. The plants weren't dead or brittle. They stood rigid and pale, each stem bleached to a ghostly bone white. It was as if the bog itself had drawn out every trace of color and life, leaching the green from the stalks and leaving only a memory behind. The air within that ring appeared unnaturally still, as though something ancient had pressed its thumbprint there, erasing the world's warmth, leaving a silence that buzzed at the edge of hearing. I waited alone there until the Gardaí, the local police, had arrived at dawn and secured the scene. Blue strobes flickered across the bog mist, splintering the darkness into slices. I stood behind the yellow tape, the damp cold of the bog seeping through the soles of my boots, watching Inspector Miller. He ducked under the perimeter tape, hands buried in his coat pockets, boots leaving careful prints in the waterlogged ground. He stopped at the edge of Liam's camp, surveying the scene with the practiced blankness of someone who's catalogued 100 small tragedies. "Hello, Crashley. Hello, Bo."
Yeah, well, looks tidy to me," he muttered,
The words sounding like old coffee and routine.
"No blood, no boot prints heading away from camp, no sign of a struggle, or that anyone forced your tent flap open, No tire tracks on the access road."
He frowned at the untouched mug, an open tin of peaches crystallizing in the cold air, the impossibly neat circle of blanched heather.
"Bah, not even a sign of wildlife,"
he added, quieter now as the silence pressed back. Though I had heard a dry rustle cut through that silence, too heavy for a rat, too light for a fox. For a heartbeat I had glimpsed a shadow low to the ground, a single glint like a moonlight on the glass. By the time I turned, it was gone. Miller knelt, shining his torch along the white stems. He grunted.
Yeah, it's odd. We get strange ground out here sometimes. Mineralizations, sinkholes, frost. God knows what all.
His breath misting in the chill air. He prowled about the perimeter of our camp, boots sinking into peat, eyes scanning for a hint of order in the chaos.
Looks like your boy just vanished, Sarah. But people don't just dissolve into thin air.
He glanced up at me.
People leave traces, sooner or later.
He straightened, pulling his collar up against the cold, but his eyes lingered on the circle in the heather, as if waiting for something to move. Miller has spent 20 years looking at the worst of humanity, and he has no room left in his head for the impossible. Every breath I took, every move I made, I felt like someone watching me. The air tasted of peat and slow decay, heavy on my tongue. Cold seeped into my marrow, settling behind my ribs like wet sand. Liam's boots sat side by the tent door, laces mud stiff from yesterday's walk, as if he'd simply stepped out and would return any second. His mug was still half full on the folding table, steamless now, of course, but when I leaned close, the surface rippled as if disturbed by invisible pulse. Everything was as it should be, and yet nothing was right. The air buzzed with a hush, the kind that presses down on the eardrums and muffles your own heartbeat. I knelt beside the white ring of heather, still not daring to touch it. In its center, Liam's mobile and watch waited like offerings, both warped and silent, their purpose leached away. The place felt newly abandoned and yet impossibly old. As if 2 moments, Liam's departure and something much older, were layered atop one another, separated only by a breath. As I knelt there, a hush all over the world, the mist curling, at the edge of my vision, something did move. A hare, gaunt and gray, with a single luminous red eye set square in its brow. It paused atop a tangle of blackthorn roots, watching me with that unblinking, impossible gaze. For a breath it seemed as though the world held still, as if the hare itself decided whether I belonged, and whether I was meant to stay or vanish like Liam and those before. And then with a quick shuffle it slipped beneath the brambles and was gone, leaving not a track behind.
Fried,
Miller called to me from within the circle, his voice tight, not noticing the hare.
Yeah, the internal circuitry is slagged. Static discharge, maybe. A localized lightning strike, I don't know.
There wasn't a cloud in the sky last night, Inspector, I said. My voice sounded thin, like a reed vibrating the wind. And look at his watch. The inspector looked. The watch, a rugged stainless steel diver's watch, sat next to the mobile. The glass face wasn't cracked, but the metal casing was slightly warped, twisted like warm wax, as if it had been subjected to intense, impossible pressures. Yet the nylon strap sitting right against that warped metal wasn't even singed. I looked back at the white heather. In the old tales, the Seanchaí speak of the encrythlanir, the shimmer. They say that when the Aushi, the people of the mounds, pass through our world, they leave a breath of frost that never melts, even in the heat of a summer noon. It is the mark of a place where the veil has rubbed thin. He's not in the woods, Inspector, I whispered, and he's not in the trenches. He stopped, turning to me, his expression pinched with something between irritation and disbelief.
Well, you're the expert on the local tall tales. Does the bog have a trap door we haven't found?
No, I said, looking at the black shimmering surface of a nearby bog hole, a pool of water so still it looked like a sheet of dark glass. But it does have a memory, and I think Liam just stepped into it. The police left as the sun began to dip, an angry orange smear across the horizon. They promised to return with a dive team and a cadaver dog in the morning, but I knew they were wasting their time. I stayed there, alone now. I knew I should leave. Every instinct for self-preservation was screaming at me to get in my car and drive until I saw the neon lights of a petrol station. But the silence was pulling at me. It was magnetic. I walked to the edge of that white circle of heather and I knelt. I didn't touch it. I remembered the old warnings about the fairy rings, a folklore, and the hungry grass, the virgorktha. But I carefully leaned in close. I expected to hear the wind. Instead, I heard a vibration. A low rhythmic thrumming from miles beneath the peat. The slow, heavy pulse of a bowron played for a funeral, each beat dragging out forever. It was the sound of a heartbeat, slowed down until there were nearly 10 seconds between every pulse. And then the air shifted. The smell of the bog, the rot and the heather was replaced by something sharp, clean, wet, the smell of a coming storm. And then came the voice. It wasn't Liam. It was a sound of like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, the sound of a moth's wings beating against a window pane. It didn't speak a language I recognized. It was a series of glottal stops and long melodic vowels that felt like they were being spoken directly inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hand brushed against the white heather, and I felt a sharp magentic sting that raced up my arm and settled in the base of my spine. That was when I saw it. Tucked under the flap of our tent, and a spot I know the Gardaí had searched an hour before, was a bundle. It was wrapped in weathered vellum, gray and oily with age. It was tied with a string of what looked like braided sun-bleached grass. I didn't call Miller. I didn't call the station. I took the bundle, I ran to my car, and I just drove. No plan, only the frantic instinct of prey. My headlights cut wild swaths through the bog's blackness as I tore down the road to Col Moshe's cottage. The gravel winding like a resentful ribbon beneath my tires, the earth itself trying to shake me off. I didn't stop until I saw the dim, flickering amber lights of his window on the hill. I killed the engine, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the ancient vellum trembling in my lap. My panic finally broke, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. Because I understood then, Liam had not been taken. He had been translated. He had been moved from one language into another, and holding that bundle, I knew that I was the only one left who knew how to read the grammar of the dead. Colm's house is what they call a famine cottage. It's built of unmortared fieldstone, the walls 3 feet thick with a heavy thatched roof that looks like a dark furrowed brow pulled low over 2 small square windows. There's no electric light here, only the orange flickering ghost of a turf fire and the smell of damp wool, old paper, and wet iron. I didn't knock. In this part of the country, a knock is for strangers. I pushed the door open, the heavy oak groaning on its hinges, and I stepped into the stagnant air of the deserted kitchen. A kettle was boiling madly on the hob as if I was expected, so I grabbed my ancient thermos from the car and I filled its rusty innards with scalding hot tea before going in search of Colm. When I approached, he didn't turn. He was sitting in a high-backed wooden chair by the hearth, his hands resting on his knees like 2 gnarled hawthorn roots. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at the shadows in the corner of the room, as if he were watching a conversation I couldn't hear.
You have it,
he said over his shoulder to me. His voice didn't seem to come from his throat. It sounded like it was being dragged up from the bottom of a dry well, rough, stone-gray, heavy with the weight of things better left unsaid. I found it inside our tent, Colm, I said. My voice sounded thin and brittle, like glass about to crack. I held out the bundle of vellum. The Gardaí, they searched that tent 4 times. They looked under every flap, inside every boot. So did I. But it was as if it didn't exist until the moment I touched that white heather. Colm finally turned his head. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic before a storm, a deep, turbulent gray flecked with white. He gestured to the heavy oak table in the center of the room.
Lay it out, Sarah. Let the ink breathe. It's been stifled for 100 years, and a story held too long in the dark becomes a ventum.
I nodded. Venom, yes. Colm, what is it about these places? The bog, the stone. What lets them through? He nodded, slow and grave.
Bad. It's not magic. Not in the way you read in books. It's a thinness, a weakness of the world's skin. Places battered by hunger, sorrow, or too many secrets. The veil is worn thin, and sometimes the wrong thing presses through.
So it's what, like resonance?
Aye. Resonance, I suppose. Yes. Padraig called it the song. Emptiness, longing, all those invisible strings. Step on a thin spot and the rules go strange. That's when you have to be careful what you bring with you. Memories, grief, even your own story.
I placed the bundle on the table. The vellum felt oily. It had a warmth to it that was entirely unnatural for something that had been sitting in a damp tent. As I untied the braided grass string, the vellum unrolled with a sound like a sharp intake of breath. The handwriting was a nightmare. It wasn't the neat scholarly script of the 19th century. It was jagged, frantic, the letters leaning forward as if they were trying to run off the edge of the page before something caught them.
This belonged to Patrick Ogg,
Colm whispered. He stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling. He moved toward the table, but he kept a respectful distance as if the manuscript were a sleeping predator.
The last true Seanchaí of this parish, They called him the Cushi Naskal, Shadow Walker. The villagers thought he was mad because he wouldn't use the cattle pass or the borings. He said the pass were where they waited for the weary.
They? Who? The shadow folk? I asked, my fingers hovering just inches above the ink.
Mm-hmm.
Colm nodded, a slow rhythmic movement.
We call them the gentry, or the good people, because we are cowards, Sarah. We think if we give them a polite name, they will treat us with polite mercy. Aye, but Padraig knew the truth. He called them the Seanchaí, the people of the reflection.
Colm's gaze stayed fixed on the dark corner, voice low and reverent.
They're not just ghosts or fairies. They're the ones who walk in the cracks between this world and the next. Warriors, magicians, shadows given shape. Some say their queen is Scothach herself, the greatest warrior ever to walk the mists. The Scothwood aren't evil, not as we understand it today. They're drawn here by hunger, curiosity, the music of a soul coming undone. Sometimes they teach, sometimes they take, but always they blur the line between a shadow and its maker.
He leaned over the table, the orange firelight casting deep cavernous shadows across his face.
They are not from, over there, or underneath, Sarah. They are right here. They share the same space we do, like two pages in a book pressed flat against one another. Usually the paper is too thick to see through. We go about our lives, they go about ours. But in the bog, the paper gets damp, it gets thin, and sometimes a thumb presses down from the other side and the two pages become one. That's what happened to your Liam. He stepped into a quilotch, a thin spot.
I looked down at the first page. My eyes caught a passage written in a mix of Latin and dialect of Irish so ancient it felt like stone. As I began to read aloud, I fell into the rhythm of the script. The manuscript seeming to resonate with Padraig's voice. They do not take the flesh, they take the song. They leave behind the shell, the clothes, the iron, the salt. But the song of the man is pulled into the peat. To find the lost, one must not look for a body. One must look for the hole in the air where the body used to be. For where the shadow is cast without a man, the man is held without a shadow. The room felt abruptly colder. The fire on the hearth didn't seem to give off heat anymore. The white heather at the camp, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. It wasn't dead. It was a reflection, a shade of itself, drained of its resonance. Colm touched the edge of the table.
Padraig Ogg wrote this because his own brother Thomas vanished in the winter of 1847. Not from the hunger, not from the fever. He was standing in a field of potatoes, holding a shovel, and then there was only the shovel. Padraig spent 40 years trying to write the Rehid Nuwakal, a bridge of words, he called it, to bring Thomas back. He believed if he could tell Thomas's story perfectly, every syllable, every inflection, every silence, The vibration of the tale would shake the pages of the world apart and let his brother back through. But there was a warning in every telling. If a single syllable faltered, if the rhythm broke, if even one breath was out of place, the bridge could twist the wrong way, Sarah. And by naming them, instead of bringing someone home, you might only show the shadows where you live.
Oh. Did he succeed? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Colm looked at the dark corner behind me.
He vanished, just like the others. But he left the warning. Read the 3rd page, Sarah. Read what happens when the Scothwintir finds someone who is looking for them and knows their name.
I turned the pages. The vellum felt hot now, feverish. The ink on the 3rd page was a deep purple, as the color of old blood just beneath the surface. To the one who reads these words, the script began, you've already stepped under the wet paper. Do not look for footprints. Look for your own shadow. If it points away from the moon, away from the light as it ought, you're safe. If it points toward the bog, then the pull has already begun on you. I froze. I didn't want to look, but the moonlight was streaming through the small square window, cutting a bright path across the stone flags of the floor. I looked down. My shadow was there. It was there, but it didn't point toward the door, away from the window. It was stretching out unnaturally long and thin, pointing across the moonlight, directly toward the hearth, toward the dark, empty chimney that led straight up into the night, toward the bog. Colm, I whispered, my breath hitching in my throat. My shadow, it's wrong. It's pointing the wrong way. Colm didn't look at the floor. He just closed his eyes and leaned back into his chair.
And then the story is started, Sarah. You have to finish it now, or the story will finish you. A Seanchaí never leaves a story half told.
The end. Okay, not really. Colm pressed a battered tin of salt into my hand as I left.
Never cross the bog empty-handed, Sarah.
I retreated to my car, the door slamming with a metallic finality that felt like a shield. Outside, the Irish night was a wall of black ink, cold and lonely. But inside the cabin of the car, the dashboard lights glowed a soft neon blue, a tiny pathetic island of the 21st century. I ignored the heater's hum. I ignored the vibration of my mobile. I opened the manuscript to the section marked with a black ribbon of silk. Black 47, I whispered. The year 1847 is a wound in the memory of this land. But Patrick Ogg's account didn't speak of the failure of crops or the politics of the grain ships. He spoke of the thaw, not the melting of ice, but the melting of the border between what is solid and what is reflected. The hunger had a sound, the manuscript began. The script here was large, the ink applied with such force that the letters were bitten deep into the vellum. It wasn't a roar, nor a cry, only a dry papery rustle, the sound of wind sifting through a field of dead stalks that should have been corn. It was the sound of the world's skin becoming brittle. Patrick wrote of his brother, Tomas. In a village of starving shadows, Tomas was an impossibility. He was a mountain of a man, a broad-shouldered with the hands the size of spade heads and a laugh that could shake soot from the chimney. He was a cutter. While others grew weak, Tomas spent his days deep in the trenches of the Moynaloon, slicing the heavy wet peat into turfs. He was the one who kept the fires of the parish alive when the spirit of the people was guttering out. According to Patrick, hunger did more than empty out the body. It hollowed the very soul, made the weight of a person lighter, easier prey for the Scothwintir, who have always been attracted to what's left of the light. It was the eve of Samhain, the text continued, the rhythm of the sentences beginning to pulse like a slow drum. The fog had come in from the Shannon, that thick Calich's breath that turns the world to grey wool. Tomas was alone in the deep trench, the walls of black earth rising 6 feet above his head. He was reaching for his coat when the rustle of the hunger stopped. The wind died. The birds in the heather went silent, as if a hand had been cupped over the mouth of the world. And a hush fell all over the world. And then Tomas heard it. It wasn't a fiddle tune he'd ever heard in a pub or at a crossroads dance. It was a single note, a high silvery vibration that seemed to come from the very center of his own skull. There was no melody, only gravity, a sound that seemed to pull everything toward it. It was a sound that made the iron of his shovel hum and the salt in his sweat sting. He looked up from the trench. The sun was still a pale, sickly disk in the sky. But the heather at the lip of the trench wasn't purple anymore. It was turning white. Not the white of frost that sits on the leaf, but the white of bone which comes from within. Tomas climbed out, Padraig wrote, and I could almost hear the grief in the ink. He didn't climb out to run. He climbed out to follow. The white heather felt like silk beneath his boots. The air didn't smell of rot anymore. It smelled of the first day of the world. His fellow cutters, watching from the edge of the field, called out to him. They screamed his name until their throats were raw, but their voices didn't reach him. Padraig described it perfectly. It was as if the air between Tomas and the world had become a thick pane of glass. They could see his lips moving. They could see him smiling, a terrible vacant smile, but not a shiver of sound passed between them. Tomas walked toward the center of the shimmer, his heavy iron shovel still gripped in his hand. And then the world did a strange thing. The Fekint Figu, the double take. The manuscript began to vibrate beneath my fingertips, a faint high-frequency hum that felt like a hive of bees made of ice. Padraig's writing slowed here, the ink pooling in thick, dark clots as if we were struggling to describe a sight the human eye was never meant to translate into language. The Fekint Figu happened at the edge of the Liagal, the vellum whispered. Tomas stopped. He didn't turn back. He didn't look at the men screaming his name from the edge of the safety of the brown heather. He looked in the air in front of him, and the air looked back. I tried to picture it. A mirror, shattered and then glued back together by a blind man. That was the Encryth Near. Not a wall, but a ripple in the fabric of the afternoon. For a heartbeat, the men watching from the trenches saw two of him. One, Tomas, was the man they knew, his wool waistcoat stained with peat dust, his face lined with deep, weary furrows of the famine, his breath a white plume in the cold air. But the other, the reflection, was made of a light that had no sun. It was a Tomas who had never known hunger. His skin was as smooth as polished marble. His eyes were wide and filled with a terrifying silver clarity. He didn't breathe, he didn't bleed. He was a corrected version of a dying man. And then the two, they stepped into one another. It wasn't a collision, it was a resolution. It was like two notes of a chord finally finding their harmony. The flesh and blood Tomas let out a sound, not a cry of pain, but a long, shuddering sigh of relief, as if he'd been carrying a crushing weight his entire life and finally been allowed to set it down. The two versions of the man became one, and when the shimmer settled, there was only the silver one left standing in the field. He looked at us then, Padraig wrote, and the vellum felt cold as a tombstone. He looked at his own brother, but there was no recognition in those silver discs where his eyes should be. He looked at us the way a man looked at a painting of a place he's never visited. We were flat to him. We were still. We were the ghosts. And he was the only thing that was truly alive. The silver Tomas reached down. He picked up a heavy iron shovel he had dropped in his hands. In his hands, the iron didn't look like iron anymore. It began to transluce, the metal turning to a smoky, humming glass. He struck the ground. Not the soft peat of the bog, but the air itself. And the air cracked. It sounded like a frozen lake splitting under the weight of a winter moon. A fissure opened in this empty space before him. A jagged glowing tear that revealed the world of shifting geometry. Padraig described it as a hive of ice, a place where the trees were made of crystallized memory and the sky was a deep thrumming violet that never knew a cloud. The silver Tomas passed through, not really walking, but transferring. One moment he was a silhouette against the grey Irish fog, and the next he was a flicker of light in that violet distance. The tear in the air didn't close with a bang. It narrowed, thinning, and finally faded like the scent of a candle that's been blown out. When the other men finally reached the spot, their boots thudding onto the white heather, their There was nothing left. No footprints, no shovel, no Tomas. Only the silence. We dug, Patrick wrote, the ink jagged with 40 years of loss. We dug until our hands bled and the shovel snapped. We turned over every inch of the peat, thinking he was barely beneath, but he wasn't under the earth. He was behind it. He was the reflection that had finally decided to step out of the glass. I sat back in my car, the torchlight trembling in my hand. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 11:14 p.m. And then I remembered the anomaly at Liam's camp. The worked metal of his watch, the white heather, the slagged electronics, the portentous hair as witness. Liam had not been kidnapped by a person. He had been harmonized. He had been the note the shadow folk needed to complete their chord. And as the realization hit me, I heard it. On my car window, I turned my head slowly, my heart stopping in my chest. There, standing in the blackness of the bog, was Inspector Miller. He wasn't wearing his heavy Garda coat. He wasn't shivering in the damp November air. He was smiling. But there was no white of teeth, no pink of gums, no hint of living warmth, only a flicker of silver static. I didn't turn. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My hand was still clutching the vellum, the ancient oil of the manuscript seeping into my skin. To my right, outside the driver's window, Inspector Miller stood in the blackness of the bog, but it wasn't Miller. The man I'd met 3 days ago always carried a weight, stale tobacco, old coffee, the sour tang of exhaustion. This thing outside was his shape, but nothing more. There was no fog of breath on the window, no human presence pressing through the cold, just emptiness, a blankness so sharp it almost stung. The sound on the glass was rhythmic. It was a frequency. "Sarah," the thing said. The voice was Miller's, but it was entirely stripped of his tired human cadence. It spoke without pausing for breath, an unbroken, synthesized stream of sound where the S sounds lingered just a fraction of a second too long, a sibilant hiss that brought back the electric sting I'd felt when I first touched the heather. "Sarah, open the latch. The air in your cage is heavy and moist with your breathing. Step out of the dirt. Come out to the silence. Come and see the new light." I looked at my dashboard. My sat-nav was flickering, the digital map spinning wildly as if it had lost north. But I didn't need the satellites. I looked at Patrick Ogg's hand-drawn map in the manuscript. I saw it then, the map of resonances. Patrick hadn't only drawn trees and rock, he had also drawn a spiral, a series of interconnected nodes where the Earth's magnetic field had been warped by the souterrains, the weeping stone, the mouth of the earth, the fairy tree. I looked at the coordinates on my spinning map screen before it died completely. Our tent had been pitched at the exact eye of that spiral, and I was currently sitting on the tail. "Liam's waiting for you, Sarah," the false Miller whispered, leaning his face against the glass. In the moonlight, I saw his eyes. They weren't pupils and irises. They were silver discs, swirling with a faint violet static, the same hive of ice Patrick had described. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me, using my body as a landmark to orient himself in a world that felt flat to him. I remember the manuscript. "The reflection cannot touch the salt. It cannot cross the breath of the living." I reached for the window crank, my right hand sweaty on the handle, my left fumbling for my thermos of tea. My heart was a drum, beating a frantic human rhythm against the cold silver stillness outside. "You want the story, Inspector?" I said, my voice cracking but holding its ground. "Then you have to hear the end of it." I rolled down the window just enough for my arm to reach out. The lunar chill hit my face. I flung the scalding tea directly into the swirling silver of his eyes, hoping the iron rust from inside the old thermos might have some effect. And then, heart pounding, I hurled a handful of salt from Colm's battered tin after it. The crystals clung to his wet face. What came out of Miller wasn't a scream. It was a sound like glass fracturing, sharp and final. The form of the inspector flickered. For a heartbeat, he looked like a figure made of falling snow. For For another, he was a jagged tear in the night, revealing the violet, geometric sky behind the world. And then he recoiled. He didn't run. He thinned, wisping away into the mist. I didn't wait. I threw the car into gear, the tires spraying gravel and peat mud as I roared away from the tail of the spiral. I knew where the eye was now. I knew where the souterrain waited beneath the Lia Gall. If the Scothwin Tia were using Liam as a lens to see our world, then I had to go to the source. I had to break the reflection before it became permanent. "I'm coming, Liam," I whispered, the manuscript clutched in my lap like a weapon. "And I'm bringing the weight of this world with me." I drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not because I was afraid of what was following me, but because I was afraid of what wasn't. The reflection in the glass felt thin, as if the silver static from the false mirror had seeped into the tane of the mirror, turning the reflection to ash. The Lia Gall stood 3 miles from the main road, tucked into a fold of land the local farmers avoided even in the height of summer. It was a massive slab of limestone, gray and pitted like the surface of a dead moon. It didn't belong there. Geologically, it was an erratic, a traveler from a different mountain range, dropped here by retreating glacier 10,000 years ago. But as I pulled the car to a halt, the fangs of the headlights cutting twin paths of yellow through the mist, I realized it wasn't just a rock. It was a node. I tore back through my field notes, the manuscript, the Gardaí files, spreading papers across the passenger seat and dash. My fingers left smudges on everything. Ink, peat, even a smear of my own blood from a sharp stake I'd carelessly gripped back at our tent. I rifled through the stacks of historical accounts. Missing person, botanist, 1978. Missing person, schoolboy, 1923. Missing person, poet, 1956. Sheepdog trainer, 1985. Nurse, 1910. Birdwatcher, 2002. Traveler girl, 1943. Always the bog, always some phrase tucked in with the witness accounts. The shimmer, white grass, reflected sky, singing in the mist, moonlight underfoot, echoes with no mouths, the ground breathing, eyes in the water. The official files were cold, clinical. No evidence of struggle, just no logical explanation. The manuscript was more direct. It listed names and dates and always circled back to the Lia Gall, the stone at the center of it all. I connected the dots, lines spiraling over maps and margins. The pattern snapped into focus. The spiral, the souterrain, the stone. I opened the manuscript to the interrogation of the lore. Patrick Ogg had written a series of proofs, logical steps to identify the entrance to the souterrain. The Biel no Cre, the mouth of the earth, does not open for the eye, the script whispered. It opens for the unseen tremble. One must find the Caharmiak Uskaha, the exact place where the heavy dark of the stone meets the memory of the sun. I looked at my digital watch. 11:42 p.m. The moon was high, casting a long, sharp shadow from the Lia Gall. I grabbed my field kit. No electronics, they were useless here, likely to be slagged the moment I crossed the threshold. I filled a leathern pouch with rock salt from Colm's tin. I took up a battered iron-cased torch, more club than gadget, running on heavy D-cells. Old tech, heavy, practical, the kind of thing my grandmother would have trusted to keep the shadows back. And of course I grabbed the manuscript. I walked toward the stone. The air here was vibrating, a low subsonic hum that made my teeth ache. It was the same hive of ice sound, but here at the node it was loud enough to feel in my marrow. Lore and logic, I muttered, my breath a white plume in the freezing air. The lore says the stone weeps. The logic says it's a condensation point for a localized thermal anomaly. I touched the surface of the limestone. It was wet, but the moisture wasn't water. At first I thought bog butter, but it was more oily, slightly warm, and smelled faintly electrical. I looked at the shadow. According to Patrick's map, the entrance was not under the stone. It was within the shadow. I stepped into the dark silhouette cast by the moon, the reflected memory of the sun. The moment my boots crossed the line between moonlight and shadow, The world went silent. The sound of the wind vanished. The distant hum of the motorway died. Even the sound of my own heart seemed to move away from me, as if it were beating in a room 3 doors down, as if I had left my body lying somewhere in the mounds of peat. I was standing in the shadow logic. I knelt in the dirt. Patrick's manuscript spoke of a Seanchaí's warning, Oskil un Shanakas, a specific vocalization used to unlatch the stone. To enter the reflection, one must speak the name of the absence, the text read. Now I am a scholar. I know the phonetics of Old Irish. I know the glottal stops of the pre-Christian dialects, even if imperfectly. But this required something more than academic knowledge. It required resonance. If the stone at Tara was the roar of presence, then the stone here, the Lia Gal, was the frequency of what was missing. It was the name of the void left behind in sorrow and loss. I began to hum. Not a tune, but a low vibrating note. The same frequency I'd heard coming from the bog. I pushed the sound from my diaphragm, letting it rattle against my ribs. The Lia Gal responded. The oily moisture on the rock began to vibrate, forming intricate geometric patterns, somatic shapes that looked like the violet sky that Patrick had described. The limestone didn't move, but the shadow did. It deepened. It didn't just darken, it unfolded. It became a hole in the fabric of the allen peat. Liam? I called out. My voice didn't echo. It was swallowed by the dark. I stepped directly into the hole, but I didn't fall. I transferred. The souterrain was not a cellar. It was a lung. The walls were made of dry stone masonry, fitted together with precision that defied the primitive tools of the Iron Age. There was no mortar, no mud, just the perfect crushing weight of the earth held back by the logic of the same arch the Romans used millennia after this place was constructed. A faint thump like a rabbit's foot, and then a shuffle echoed in the dark, though I saw nothing moving in the mist. But as I moved deeper, the stones began to change. Under the beam of my iron torch, the limestone looked almost transparent. I could see shapes trapped inside the rock, not fossils of fish or shells, but shapes that looked like frozen lightning. They aren't mythical creatures, I whispered to myself, Sarah the scholar, the manuscript clutched to my chest. They are displacements, tangible physical entities that exist in a state of high-frequency vibration. The shadow folk were the real-world application of ancient physics. The Seanchaí hadn't just been telling fairy tales. They had been providing a user manual for a breach between the dimensions. I reached the central chamber, the beehive. The floor was covered in a layer of white heather, perfectly preserved, glowing with a faint violet luminescence. And there, sitting on a stone bench at the far end of the chamber, was a figure. No, it wasn't a hare, not this time. But it looked like Liam. It was wearing Liam's flannel shirt and Liam's hiking boots. But it was sitting too still. It didn't have the weight of a living man. It looked like a photograph that had been folded into a 3-dimensional shape. Liam? I said again. The figure didn't turn. It spoke. But the sound didn't come from its mouth. It came from the stone themselves all around us.
Sarah,
the Liam said.
The pattern is beautiful. Why did we ever bother with the solid?
I looked at his feet. Liam had no shadow. Behind him, the air began to flicker. The sibilants of the false miller returned, 1,000 voices whispering in 1,000 dead languages.
He's translated Seanchai,
the voices hissed. They knew my name.
He is the lens. And now, we would like to see the rest of your world through you.
beehive chamber was a masterpiece of corbelled stone, a spiraling dome that seemed to pull the very air upward into a single point of darkness at the apex. It felt like Newgrange on the Boyne, that same heavy, intentional stillness. But instead of being built for a midwinter sun, this place was built for a light that didn't come from the sky. The walls were etched with spirals, resembling the curbstones. In the beam of my torch, they didn't look like carvings, they looked like grooves in a record. They were precise, mathematical, and as I moved, the light caught the crystalline flecks of the limestone, making the spirals seem to spin. "Liam, Liam," I whispered. My voice echoed, then multiplied, bouncing back from stone to stone in a chorus of unfamiliar tones, breaking against the stones and coming back at me layered, distorted. Liam sat on a central stone plinth. His face was a mask of terrifying serenity. He wasn't looking at the walls. He was looking at the air directly in front of his eyes, where a shimmering violet void was slowly expanding. I saw them then, the Scoth Wintir. They appeared not as monsters, but as something close to perfect. Their forms shifted between silhouette and silver geometry, bodies forged of mist and angles, impossible to hold in focus. They shimmered like static behind your eyelids, faceless yet intent, moving not with footsteps, with the certainty of a thought. The air around them pulsed cold, swallowing warmth and color, a beauty so sharp and flawless it made my skin crawl, a perfection not meant for our world. They were like silhouettes made of falling diamonds. They didn't have faces, but they had intent. They were leaning into Liam, their forms overlapping with his, their silver fingers disappearing into his chest as if he were made of smoke. "Ah, the math. Sarah," Liam murmured. He didn't move his lips. The sound came from the stone spirals on the wall. "The math is so simple when you stop trying to be solid, Sarah. We aren't people. We're just frequencies that have forgotten how to change." I saw the translation happening in real time. Liam's flannel shirt was starting to lose its color, turning that bone white I had seen in the heather. His skin was becoming diaphanous. I could see the stone bench through his thighs. The air in the beehive chamber was no longer air. It became a pressurized, crystalline medium, a vocal vacuum that sucked the heat from my skin and the moisture from my throat. I stood at the edge of that violet shimmer, watching the version of Liam I loved dissolve into a version I feared. His hand resting on the stone plinth was no longer flesh. It was a lattice of silver lights, pulsing in time with the spirals on the walls. He wasn't breathing. He didn't need to. He was being optimized by the Scothwintir. "Stop!" I cried out. The word didn't travel. It hit the shimmer and shattered like a glass bulb against a stone wall. The shimmering figures, those diamond-cut silhouettes, turned their faceless heads toward me. They didn't move their limbs. They moved their frequency. The sound they made wasn't a voice. It was the sound of 1,000 radios tuned to a space between the stations, an agonizing hiss that felt like it was trying to unstitch my own shadow from my heels. "Seanchai," they whispered, the sound vibrating in the very marrow of my shins. "Stay. The weight of the bone is a burden. The memory of the salt is a cage. Look at the pattern. Look at the hive. It is silent. It is pure." I felt my knees buckle. The floor of the souterrain, the solid limestone reality of Ireland, felt like it was turning to liquid. My own reflection in the wet stones was beginning to stand up, reaching out a silver hand to pull me down. "No," I whispered. I reached into my bag and I pulled out the manuscript. I didn't read it for the meaning. I read it for the weight. I released my voice, the iron gravel of the living world. I let the old words come, as true as my Sassanach tongue could manage. "Ura wahin," once upon a time. "Ashis lesh unshakel Liam." Listen to the story, Liam. "Ergli, Ergli." Our heart. But the beehive chamber was fighting back. The vocal vacuum sucked the moisture from my throat with every syllable. As I drew a frantic breath for the next command, the frozen, pressurized air caught in my chest. I gasped, my dry throat clicking. For one terrifying fraction of a second, the rhythm broke. My American accent flattened the vowel, my voice cracking at the glottal stop as I desperately tried to force the words out. Philia, Philia, Hawali, come home. I felt the shimmer twitch, a momentary lapse in the bridge of words, a tiny invisible crack left open in the dark. I swallowed the copper taste of fear. I hammered the rhythm back into line, shouting louder this time to cover the slip. Kalakusa elantolov! Put your feet on the earth. No se le ska. Don't lose your shadow. Kroshim tu fehim tu. I hear you. I see you. No forshin. Don't leave us behind. For what felt like hours, I hurled my own voice against that darkness, driving myself, wielding the only weapon a Seanchaí has, the story. I shouted, pleaded, till my throat was raw. I thundered the story of Liam into the stone. Liam O'Donoghue, I roared, the name echoing like a cannon shot off the corbelled ceiling. You were born on a Tuesday in a room that smelled of sawdust and floor wax. You have a scar on your left thumb from a pocket knife you bought at an affair in Athlone. You hate the taste of overboiled tea and the smell of wet wool. You love dancing at Halloween. You are a creature of salt. You are a creature of the soil. You love Sarah Kavanaugh. With every word, I took a step forward. The shimmer resisted. It felt like walking through a gale of needles, but I didn't stop. I began to recite the genealogy of the mundane. I told the story of the time Leon tripped over a root in the bog and swore for 10 minutes straight. I told the story of how he always loses his keys in the lining of his coat. I told the story of how he burns his toast every morning, no matter how closely he watches the bread. The way he'd mutter at crossword puzzles, pen tapping against his teeth when a clue stumped him. How he always left his boots just inside the door, muddy side out. How he sang off key in the car, louder every time the rain came down. But I wasn't just talking. I was anchoring. The story is the bridge, I shouted, and a bridge has two ends. You are on this end, Liam. You are on the side of the heavy, the messy, the dirty, the loud. The figures of the Scothpuntir began to flicker. Their diamond edges were blurring, unable to maintain their pure frequency against the dirty, beautiful noise of a human life. The hiss became a shriek of static, the sound of something unspooling past the point of return. The chamber began to hum, a deep subsonic tectonic roar that felt like the Lea Gall was about to turn back into dust. The spirals on the walls, those ancient geometric circuits, began to glow with a blinding violet heat. I reached the center. I reached for Liam's hand. It felt like grabbing a handful of cold electricity. My own skin began to shimmer, the silver static creeping up my arm. I could see the hive of ice behind him, a vast, lonely perfection that wanted to swallow us both. The static was screeching now, clawing at the back of my teeth. Desperate, I fumbled in my bag and I grabbed a handful of salt. With a shaking hand, I scattered a jagged line between us and the shimmering figures. The air pulsed. The Scothpuntir recoiled, their perfect edges warping, forced to bend around every stubborn grain. Salt is the anchor, I whispered, my voice ragged and low. Salt keeps us solid. Salt keeps us home. The air buzzed, thick as the peat itself. I lunged for Liam. Cold stone scraped my knees, grit grinding under my palms as I grabbed his wrist. His skin was clammy, almost slick, the shimmer crawling up my fingers like frostbite. Salt from my own sweat stung the cut of my hand from the tent stake. I yanked with everything I had, muscle, memory, noise, dragging him bodily across the rough limestone away from the violet tear. The story is finished, I screamed. Then I used the final forbidden vocalization from Patrick Ogg's manuscript. A sound that isn't a word, but a snap of the glottis, a sound that represents the end of the line. The violet light imploded. For a microsecond, the chamber was filled with a blackness so absolute it felt like physical weight. And then the thud. Oh, it was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. It wasn't the tinkle of silver or the hiss of static. It was a heavy, wet, meaty sound of a human body hitting a stone floor. Thump. The violet light was gone. The scoffwentia were gone. The spirals in the walls were just cold, damp limestone once again. I fell to my knees, my breath coming in trembling, sobbing gasps from my strained, abused throat. I reached out in the dark, my fingers finding the rough, warm, beautifully dirty flannel of Liam's shirt. He was shivering. He was coughing. He was bleeding from a small cut on his forehead where he'd hit the stone. He was real. Sarah, he whispered. His voice was cracked, human, and wonderfully thin. I've got you, I said in a tattered voice, pulling his head into my lap. The page is closed, Liam. We're back on the solid now. But as I held him, I looked at the floor. My torch was dying, but in its final flickering beam, I saw something. Our shadows. Liam had his shadow back, yes. But mine? Mine was still pointing the wrong way. It was still stretching out toward the bog, as if it were a leash that hadn't been quite snapped. We left the Leogal behind us, but the stone didn't feel finished with us. I had to carry Liam for the first 100 yards. He was solid, but he was hollow, like a man who had his internal organs removed and replaced with nothing but frozen air. His weight was a miracle to me, though. Every time he stumbled, every time his boot crunched against the frost-white heather, I felt a surge of fierce protective triumph. Don't look back, Liam, I whispered. My own voice was a ghost of itself, shredded by the acoustic combat in the chamber. The story only exists. The story only exists if we keep moving forward, Liam. The bog at 4 a.m. is a place between the worlds. The mist had returned, thicker now, a gray shroud that smelled of ancient rot and wet iron. The hive of ice hum was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like we were the only two people left on a dead planet. But as we walked, I felt the scrutiny. It wasn't a sound, it was the feeling of 1,000 silver eyes looking through the thin spots in the air. The heather rustled, swelling towards us as we passed. The black pools of bog holes didn't reflect the moon anymore. They looked like open, lidless eyes watching our every step. Sarah, Liam croaked. It was the first time he used his own voice, his real voice, in hours. I can still hear the math. It's sinking in the base of my skull. Ignore it, Liam, I said, my grip on his arm tightening until my knuckles were white. The math is a lie. The only truth is the weight of your boots and the cold in your lungs. Focus on the solid, Liam. Focus on the dirty. Focus on me. We reached the car just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. My little island of glass and steel looked like a miracle now. The Gardaí found us an hour later. It was a strange thing to see them. Inspector Miller in his tweed hat, the young officers in their high-visibility vests, the blue lights of the cruisers pulsing against the gray mist. It was so normal, so aggressively mundane. Miller approached, his boots thudding on the gravel with a heavy human rhythm that I now knew how to value. He looked at Liam, shivering, mud-caked, and staring at nothing. Then he looked at me.
We found your car on the access road, Sarah,
Miller said. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man who was ready for his breakfast and long sleep.
What happened? Where was he?
I looked at Miller. I looked for the silver static behind his teeth. I listened for the hiss in his S sounds. But he was just a man. A tired, cynical, wonderful man. He was in the souterrain, Inspector, I said. My husky, rattling voice felt like it was coming from a great distance. He got disoriented. He fell. The air is different down there. Miller looked at the Leogal on the hill. He shook his head.
I told you, kids. These old places, they aren't safe. The ground is unstable. What, the long memory you called it?
I nodded. The Quimiv Nodata.
Miller retorted. I call it a sinkhole risk.
Miller ran hand over his stubbled jaw, blinking as if he'd just come out of a long tunnel.
Feels like I've been out here all night. Truth is, I barely remember the drive. Just fog and road, and then
He shook his head, dismissing it.
getting old, I suppose.
I didn't argue. I didn't tell him about the people of the reflection. I didn't tell him about the map of resonances. I didn't tell him his own soul had nearly been forfeit this night, save for some rusty hot tea and a handful of salt. You don't tell a man like Miller that his world is just a wet piece of paper being pressed from the other side. You let him have his sinkholes. They took Liam to the hospital in Tullamore. They said he was suffering from exposure and dissociative shock. They gave him blankets and saline drips, and psychiatric evaluations. They treated the shell because the shell is all they could see. On that long walk back through the mist, I caught a glimpse of the hare's reflection in a pool of bog water. In the water, it seemed to have two eyes. I looked up quickly, and there it was, a hunched shape, moon bright and still, watching from atop a sunken stone. Its single red eye blinked at me, slow as dusk. Then it was gone, leaving only a ripple through the grass and a hush settling over the bog. It has been 3 months since that night in the beehive. Liam is back at university. He's healthy physically. He's put the weight back on, but he doesn't do field work anymore. We visited the bog together on Beltane, the 1st of May, another Friday, but not a 13th. At first, Liam seemed uninterested in what was once his passion. He denies it, but I think he spotted the hare. Then his disinterest quickly turned to agitation, and beneath it all I can sense an undercurrent of terror. Now he works the basement of the archives, where there are no windows and the light is always fluorescent and safe. I don't need his reasons, but it breaks my heart. We don't speak. He doesn't look at me the way he used to. We used to be together, every day together. Now I feel that I've lost my best friend. It hurts. Sometimes when we're sitting in the library, I'll see him freeze. He'll be staring at a blank page or a flickering computer screen, and I know just what he's hearing. He's hearing the hive of ice. He's hearing the math. I still have Patrick Ogg's manuscript. It sits in a locked drawer in my desk. But I don't need to open it to remember the words. They're written on the inside of my eyelids. I know now why the Seanchaí were so respected and so feared. They weren't just keeping history. They were the Kumadi, the guardians, the keepers. The Seanchaí were the ones who stood at the thin spots and shouted the world back into being. I suppose I have become a Seanchaí now, but I am still a student, not a master. Somewhere in the heat of my battle, in the invocation in the chamber, I faltered. I missed a word. I lost the rhythm. I let fear slip in where certainty should have been. My Sassanach tongue had betrayed me after all. Because I didn't get it quite right, perfect. The Scothwentir are still watching. The story isn't finished with me. I made a mistake. It's the end of June now, and last night I was standing in my kitchen. The moon was full, just as it had been on the bog. It blanched the room, streaming through the window to cast a sharp shadow of me against the white tile floor. I looked down. I had a shadow. It was dark and it was solid. But as I watched, I moved my arm to reach for a glass of water. My shadow didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, its hand resting on the reflection of a table that wasn't even there. And then slowly, my shadow turned its head. My shadow looked at me. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its intent. It was a silver static trapped in a black silhouette. It was no longer a reflection of me. It was a viewport. I realized then what Padraig Ogg meant by the bridge of words. But as Colm had warned, a bridge doesn't just let you cross. It also lets the Unsir Ella, the other side, see where you live. I brought Liam back. I broke the rhythm. I saved the man. I had not left any of my blood on the battlefield, but maybe I am a warrior after all. But the Scothwentir, they never forget a voice that dares speak their name.
And they know my name, my true name. And now they have a voice of their own. My only weapon is my story. And they're waiting for me to run out of words. Another Friday the 13th is coming. 13 days after Samhain, Halloween. Just 5 months away from now in November. I wonder if that will be the day they return for me. To collect on my mistake. I had never been one for bad luck superstitions. But now... now... if I lose my story, I lose myself. I'll forget my own name. I'll be only a story, told in someone else's voice, a fading whisper among the stones. Just another echo for them to play with. I have to keep speaking. I have to stay thick, dirty, loud, and real. But the bog is a very patient library. Schlangefoil.